Picture this: World War II, the most mechanized war in human history. Tanks, machine guns, fighter planes, heavy artillery, modern war at its most brutal. And in the middle of all of it, one British officer charges into battle carrying a longbow, a Scottish broadsword, and a set of bagpipes. Not as a joke, not as a stunt. Because he believed an officer should never go into battle without his sword. His name was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, but history remembers him by a better name: Mad Jack Churchill. And every unbelievable story you're about to hear is real.
History is full of myths, but the truth is hidden. Myths and the secrets behind them.
John Churchill was born in 1906 in Surrey, England. He came from a military family. From the beginning, he was different. He attended Sandhurst, Britain's equivalent of West Point. Then he was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment. But Jack Churchill was never going to be a typical officer. Because outside the army, his hobbies were already unusual. Very unusual. While stationed in Burma in the 1930s, Churchill took up the bagpipes, and he didn't just play casually. He became genuinely skilled, good enough to perform at military events and competitions. But the bagpipes were not even his strangest hobby. Because Jack Churchill had another obsession: archery, and not hobby-level archery. He was elite. He represented Great Britain at the 1939 World Archery Championships. So before World War II had even begun, Mad Jack Churchill was already a professional soldier, an international archer, and a highly skilled bagpipe player. And just to make things even stranger, he also had a small role in the 1924 adventure film The Thief of Baghdad, because apparently soldier, archer, and musician were not enough. He also had to add actor. By the late 1930s, Churchill had left the army for a time. He worked as a newspaper editor in Kenya. But as Europe moved toward another great war, he re-enlisted. Because Jack Churchill was not the kind of man who would sit out the biggest conflict in human history. And this is where the story goes from unusual to completely unbelievable. May 1940, France. The British Army is retreating toward Dunkirk. German forces are closing in fast. Churchill's unit moves through a small village called Lepinette. Most soldiers are keeping their heads down, moving quickly, trying not to be seen. Churchill does something else entirely. He steps into the open, raises a longbow, and fires. The arrow strikes a German non-commissioned officer, killing him instantly. In the middle of World War II, a British officer had just killed an enemy soldier with a medieval weapon. To this day, Churchill is believed to be the only soldier in the war to kill an enemy combatant with a longbow. 5 centuries after Agincourt, the longbow had returned to battle. After Dunkirk, Churchill returned to Britain. But he wasn't done. He was just getting started. He volunteered for a new force, the British Commandos. These were elite troops trained for raids, sabotage, and surprise attacks behind enemy lines. Fast, aggressive, unconventional. Exactly where Mad Jack Churchill belonged. Then came one of the most cinematic moments of his entire war. December 1941, Operation Archery. The target was the German-occupied Norwegian island of Vågsøy. British commandos approached the coast in landing craft through freezing water. The men were tense. The Germans were waiting. The moment the ramps dropped, chaos would explode. At the front of the landing craft stood Major Jack Churchill. And as they approached the beach, he pulled out his bagpipes and began playing March of the Cameron Men at full volume through the freezing Norwegian wind. Then the ramp dropped. Churchill threw a grenade, drew his broadsword and charged ashore. Bagpipes screaming, sword in hand. His men followed him into battle. The raid was a success. Churchill received the Military Cross for his actions, and his citation described his behavior as cool and gallant leadership, which may be the most British understatement in military history. But if you think that story sounds insane, you haven't heard the next one. By 1943, Churchill was fighting in the Mediterranean theatre. He was leading No. 2 Commando along the Adriatic coast of Yugoslavia. This was dangerous ground. Harsh terrain, constant ambushes, unpredictable enemy positions, and for Churchill, it was perfect. During one operation on the island of Brač, his commandos launched a night attack on a German stronghold. But the plan quickly began to collapse. Supporting units failed to arrive. His men were pinned down. The attack was stalling. Most commanders in that situation would have ordered a retreat. Churchill ordered a charge, with his broadsword and his bagpipes, again. It sounds like fiction. It sounds like someone took a war story and let a fantasy writer rewrite it. But this was Mad Jack Churchill. Against all odds, the attack succeeded. By the end of the engagement, Churchill and his men had captured 42 German prisoners. 42. That number alone feels impossible. And every time you think this story cannot get any more ridiculous, it does. For his actions, Churchill received the Distinguished Service Order. Later, he received a bar to that DSO. Essentially, a second award for gallantry. Mad Jack Churchill was becoming one of the most decorated soldiers in the British Army. And he was doing it while fighting like a warrior from another century. At this point, imagine the Germans facing him. Machine guns, mortars, automatic rifles. And somewhere in the smoke, a British officer appears with a sword, a bow, and bagpipes. There are soldiers who are terrifying because of discipline, others because of reputation. Mad Jack Churchill must have been terrifying because he made absolutely no sense. And sometimes, the thing that makes no sense is the thing you fear most. But even Mad Jack was not invincible. In 1944, during another operation in Yugoslavia, his luck finally ran out. His unit was ambushed. Churchill was knocked unconscious. And when he woke up, he was a prisoner of the Germans. Some accounts say he was still playing his bagpipes when they captured him. Whether every detail is exact or not, it fits the legend perfectly. By then, Churchill had become less like an ordinary officer, and more like a myth walking around in combat boots. The Germans, reportedly unsure what to make of him, sent him to Berlin for interrogation. From there, he was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most notorious camps in Nazi Germany. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. For Mad Jack Churchill, it was just another chapter, because he escaped. In 1945, Churchill made his way out and began traveling roughly 90 miles through enemy-held territory toward Allied lines in Italy. Think about that for a second. After everything he had already survived, France, Norway, Yugoslavia, commando raids, charges, ambushes, captivity, he still wasn't finished. Eventually, exhausted but alive, he reached American forces. The war in Europe ended not long after, and here is one of the strangest details of all. Churchill was reportedly disappointed that the war was ending, not relieved, disappointed, because he wanted to continue fighting in the Pacific against Japan. And when the atomic bombs ended the war, Churchill is said to have remarked, "If it wasn't for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. Which is either a joke, an outrageous opinion, or the most Mad Jack Churchill sentence ever spoken. Probably all three. So what does a man like Mad Jack Churchill do after surviving the most violent conflict in human history? He learns to surf. Of course he does. In the post-war years, Churchill served in Palestine and continued his military career. But in the 1950s, he also became one of the first people to surf the Severn Bore in England. The Severn Bore is a tidal wave that travels up the River Severn. Not exactly Malibu, but Jack Churchill found a way to surf in Britain. Because apparently normal hobbies were still beneath him, he remained in the army for years after the war, and eventually retired in 1959 as a lieutenant colonel after more than 3 decades of service. In retirement, he continued many of the pursuits that had always made him unusual: archery, music, travel, adventure. Those who knew him later in life described him as friendly, amusing, and surprisingly modest, which is incredible for a man whose life sounded like a war memoir written by someone trying to make it less believable. He lived until 1996. He died at the age of 89, and there is something deeply fitting about that. The man who charged into World War II with a broadsword and a longbow lived long enough to see the end of the Cold War. He outlived empires. He outlived the war that made him famous. He outlived almost everything that should have killed him. Mad Jack Churchill earned the Military Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and a bar to that DSO. He fought in France, Norway, Yugoslavia, the Middle East, and Palestine. He killed an enemy soldier with a longbow, led commando raids with a sword, captured dozens of prisoners, escaped Nazi captivity, and then went surfing. Churchill once said, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." And somehow, when you hear that quote, it doesn't sound like a joke. It sounds like a perfect summary of the man, because in a war defined by machines, distance, and industrial slaughter, Mad Jack Churchill insisted on fighting face to face, sword in hand, bagpipes screaming, like he was personally refusing to let the modern world tell him how a warrior was supposed to behave. Was he reckless? Absolutely. Was he eccentric? Beyond question. Was he brave? Without a doubt. And maybe that's why his story still resonates, because Mad Jack Churchill feels like the kind of person history is no longer capable of producing. Too strange to invent, too dramatic to exaggerate, too real to ignore. The world produced exactly one Mad Jack Churchill, and history has never seen another soldier quite like him. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Myths and Other Secrets, because the most unbelievable stories in history are often the true ones. And trust me, we're just getting started. Now I want to know from you, which part of Mad Jack Churchill's story sounds the most unbelievable? The longbow kill, the bagpipes on the beach, the 42 prisoners, or the fact that after all of that, he decided to go surfing? For me, it's still the longbow, every single time.